Do you know the story of Lot's daughters and the forgotten sin? This is one of the most shocking narratives in the Bible, and almost no one talks about it. A story that involves fear, silence, and choices that still echo today. Lot's daughters and the forgotten sin are not just an old chapter, they are a current warning. What happens when faith mixes with the corrupted culture around us? And when we try to fix things our way, does it work? Stay with me. What you're about to hear might change the way you see what's right, what's wrong, and the eternal. Have you ever heard of the forgotten sin in the Bible? Those that most people avoid talking about, brush over, or simply pretend they never read? Well, there's a story in the Old Testament that, although it's right there laid out in the book of Genesis, is almost a taboo. Biblical incest, starring Lot's daughters. Yes, the same Lot who fled from Sodom and Gomorrah before divine destruction fell like fire from the sky. But what happened afterward, few have the courage to face. This story is more than shocking. It's a spiritual mirror. It shows how moral corruption can remain alive even outside the condemned city, how the absence of discernment, disobedience to God, and unresolved fear can create legacies that last for centuries. And believe me, understanding this is not just about knowing the past, but about protecting yourself in the present. Because when values are lost, even those who were saved can become corrupted. If you want to go beyond the surface, understand the deep layers of this narrative, and still discover what Romans 12:2 has to do with all of this, stay with me until the end. This video is not just another Bible study, it's a warning, a revelation, and perhaps the beginning of a transformation in the way you read the Bible and live your faith. Sodom was not just a perverted city, it was the portrait of moral degradation in its most explicit form. There, Christian values were mocked, and even the angels sent by God were threatened as if they were mere travelers. It was as if evil had become routine, as if the conscience had been turned off. When moral corruption takes over even common sense, God's judgment is not far behind. And it was in this scenario that Lot tried to build his life. Just imagine the spiritual challenge that represents. God, seeing the perversity that ruled there, decided to act with justice, not out of impulse, but out of zeal. The divine destruction announced was not an unthoughtful punishment, but a warning to generations. Sin has a deadline. Think about that in your daily life. When you silence your conscience just to please your environment, you are repeating the mistake of Sodom. This story is not distant. It's in the small choices we make at work, in friendships, even in what we consume on social media. The presence of angels in Sodom was like turning on a light in a room filled with darkness, and yet the men preferred to extinguish the light. This says a lot about how hardened the human heart can become. The Old Testament is filled with such examples, but here in Genesis, the message is clear. When immorality becomes culture, ruin is imminent. And it doesn't stop there. There's someone in this story who chose to walk by faith, even in the midst of the chaos around them. While Lot was attracted to the prosperous appearance of Sodom, Abraham was guided by something invisible, faith. One looked at what brought immediate profit, the other at what pleased God's heart. And this difference isn't just biblical, it's timeless. How many times do we trade inner peace for a higher salary, a better status, or a relationship that seems good? Faith versus materialism is a silent battle that takes place every day within our minds. Abraham chose to obey, even without knowing exactly where he was going. Lot, on the other hand, seeing the fertile plains near Sodom, thought, "There I can grow." But growing without direction is just swelling. His choice exposed his family to the moral corruption that consumed that city. It's like planting in fertile land, but with poison in the soil. Sometimes the brightest path is the most dangerous, and we only realize it when we're already too far gone. The contrast between the two reveals something profound. True prosperity doesn't come just from the place, but from the presence of God in that place. Lot sought security in resources, Abraham in his relationship with the Creator. And this makes all the difference when God's judgment knocks on the door. Remember, choosing wisely is not just about intelligence, it's about spiritual discernment. And this becomes even more evident when the two separate and Lot makes a decision that changes everything. The separation between Lot and Abraham wasn't due to lack of love, but because of an excess of goods. It almost seems ironic, doesn't it? But sometimes What seems like a blessing can turn into an obstacle. The shepherds of both began to argue, and to avoid confusion, Abraham proposed that each go their separate ways. Lot then looked toward the plains of the Jordan and saw an opportunity for progress. The problem was that he didn't look through the eyes of faith, but through the lens of self-interest. This choice was the beginning of a series of questionable moral decisions. He didn't just move near Sodom, he ended up living inside it. Slowly, the moral corruption stopped seeming absurd and became everyday. This happens when we normalize small concessions, like when you start laughing at something immoral, then accepting it, and finally practicing it. It's a slow process, but dangerous. Abraham, on the other hand, stayed with the less attractive part of the land, but remained steadfast in his obedience to God. And it's amazing how God always honors those who choose by the Spirit, not by the flesh. The book of Genesis makes this clear. Lot looked outward and saw advantage. Abraham looked inward and saw purpose. And this difference becomes even more evident as the story progresses and three heavenly figures appear on the scene. Sodom wasn't just morally decayed, it was also politically unstable. And when the war between kings of the region broke out, Lot was taken as a prisoner. This reveals a painful truth. When we get too involved with corrupted environments, we end up paying the price for other people's choices. He didn't go to war, but suffered the consequences. It's like today. When someone chooses to live surrounded by bad influences, it doesn't take long before chaos knocks on their door. But here comes one of the most beautiful parts of this story. Abraham, even though he had separated from Lot, didn't abandon his nephew. He gathered his men, went after the enemies, and rescued him. This is intercession with action. It wasn't just a prayer, it was an attitude. And that's often what's missing. People willing to fight for others, even when those others seem to have dug their own hole. You know that friend who got lost in wrong choices? Sometimes all they need is someone to go after them. The surprising thing is that even after being saved, Lot went back to Sodom. This shows the power the environment has over someone who's already contaminated. He could have returned to Abraham, learned from the mistake, but he chose the false security of the city. Moral corruption had already taken root, and this is where one of the most intense moments of the narrative begins. The intimate conversation between Abraham and God, where intercession reaches a new level. When the angels arrived at Lot's house, it was the last sign of mercy before the fall. They warned, "Leave here now." And even in the face of urgency, Lot hesitated. The moral corruption of Sodom had become so familiar, so normal, that leaving it seemed painful. And here comes one of the most serious lessons from the Old Testament. When God tells you to leave, it's because staying means dying. There are places, friendships, and habits that need to be left behind, and quickly. While the angels practically dragged the family out of the city, an instruction was given. Do not look back. Simple, direct, but profound. Lot's wife didn't obey. In a gesture that seemed small, she looked, and she turned into a pillar of salt, an eternal symbol that disobedience, even in the small details, has consequences. Sometimes the problem isn't just leaving Sodom, it's getting Sodom out of you. Obedience to God isn't about understanding everything, it's about trusting even when it doesn't make sense. Imagine the weight of that moment. Fire falling from the sky, screams, destruction, and there, in the midst of the escape, Lot seeing his wife become a monument to what he needed to forget. This scene speaks to the soul of anyone who has tried to leave the past but still looks back at it with longing. And what comes after is even more uncomfortable. A new beginning inside a cave, marked not by peace, but by choices that reveal how trauma and environment shape the next steps. And now, tell me, have you been looking back like Lot's wife, trying to keep some Sodom alive inside of you? Or have you been living like Abraham, distancing yourself from corruption and walking by faith? The story you just heard isn't just about Lot and his daughters. It's about me, you, and the choices we make every day. What are you building with your decisions? Will you leave a legacy of conflict or of faith? Have you ever stopped to think about how many emotional caves still exist inside of you, full of unresolved traumas and hasty decisions? It's time to leave them. Applying this knowledge is more than studying the Bible. It's facing life with spiritual eyes. Choose to act differently. Choose to obey. Choose not to repeat the mistakes. And if all of this moved you, then share in the comments what part of this story confronted you the most. Take a moment to subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell so you don't miss any content, and continue this journey with me. Here, we don't just learn, we transform the way we live our faith. Ready to join me?